I often joke that one of the biggest challenges we have is if we tell somebody something they already know, then it's boring and we haven't added any new value. If we tell them something that's new and interesting, then they don't believe you because they thought something different. We're constantly trying to find that battle of being believable, telling the narrative, whilst also being interesting, which is hard.
Welcome to Any Insights Yet? The podcast that explores the intersection of strategy, inspiration, and branding. I'm Chris Kocek. In today's episode, I'm joined by James Addlestone, head of data arts at Saatchi & Saatchi. James has a somewhat unusual background as both a data scientist and behavioral economist, and his approach to data feels more like a detective story than a dashboard deep dive. That's because James uses a variety of techniques to help with everything from strategic consulting to performance marketing to enhancing the customer experience. His work crosses multiple categories with past clients including Ralph Lauren, Tesco, and Subway, among others. And he's made a career out of finding those nuanced human truths that often get lost in spreadsheets and survey results. During our conversation, James and I talk about why most brands end up marketing to superficial stereotypes instead of real human truths, and why you should never ignore outlier data. We also talk about the skills that you should double down on if you want to be a successful analyst, and we explore some different AI tools James likes to use on different projects. To get things started, though, James and I talk about a World War I data point that had a profound impact on him when he was a teenager. What's the first time you remember noticing something where you were like, doesn't anybody else notice this?
In the UK, when you're kind of 13, 14, obligatory history is basically, World War I, World War II. But we were lucky enough to go to the battle site of the Battle of the Somme. Very morbid start to the podcast, but I remember the teacher kind of sitting in front of the battleground and saying, look, on day one of this battle, 20,000 British soldiers died and 30,000 were injured. And everyone was kind of looking around thinking, God, that's a lot of people, isn't it? Yeah, it's really bad. And then they said, look, imagine Elland Road. So Elland Road is the football stadium for Leeds United, which is my local team. And he said, imagine Elland Road, and imagine overnight half of that entire crowd dies and the other half is terribly injured. And suddenly that number was just massively brought to life. And it was just a very kind of solemn moment of, okay, now I get it, right? Now that's a lot of people. But I think it's a really good and important lesson of how do you tell a narrative using data? Obviously, that data point in itself is fairly meaningless. It's like, I think the UK economy or something is like $3.8 trillion. And it's like, okay, well, that in itself is almost entirely meaningless. But saying the UK economy is $3.8 trillion and the US is $30 trillion, suddenly that number has a friend and you have meaning given to that number. So yeah, I guess that would be my aha moment as a kid is how do you start to tell narratives rather than just shout data?
Mm-hmm. I read somewhere that people are particularly bad at understanding that 1 million is very, very different than 1 billion.
There's actually a really good book, a book called Factfulness. And I can't remember the author, but he basically talks through, very similar to that, a series of different heuristics that we follow when it comes to numbers. That means that we just have like a terrible perception of how the world actually works. And he basically said exactly that. We have kind of an order of magnitude bias where once it gets to above a certain number, our brains are just unable to fathom bigger numbers and the context towards those big numbers. So we just turn off. It's like the distance to the sun versus the distance to a different galaxy. It's just we can't even internalize what that could possibly mean. So we just switch off from that number altogether, which I think is really interesting. And it makes it very difficult when you're working for huge businesses who do operate in often the billions to kind of make those numbers real.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I recommend in my insight workshops is to look for those WTF data points, something that makes you say, really? Like, that's just crazy. And so like when I was talking with Dan Cohen in an earlier episode, he said he had found a data point that said Americans eat over 1 billion chicken wings on Super Bowl Sunday. Or a data point that I'm sure Netflix was aware of in those early days, that Blockbuster Video charged $800 million in late fees in a single year. Those are staggering numbers. Can you think of any examples where you came across a data point that was just hard to believe and it compelled you to dig deeper until you got to something of an aha moment?
this is going to sound very tangential, but I promise you I will answer the question. But I used to love Agatha Christie as a kid, the whodunit novels. I do like to think that our job is a little bit like that. So how do you start to understand all these different pieces of this jigsaw, but just think about it and frame those pieces of evidence in a slightly different way that allow you to get to the answer. So I think it's so rare, to be honest, that you do find a single piece of evidence or a single data point that gives you the answer. And to your point with the outliers, you kind of go through this process of trying to understand why. And I was working for a supermarket, and we saw tomatoes had suddenly grown by kind of 35% year on year. I'm like, why has this happened? And we had this dashboard that basically allowed us to look at recipes that were trending. And we saw that at the time, shakshuka was suddenly massively trending for absolutely no apparent reason, right? It's like there's no logical reason. You couldn't have predicted at the beginning of the year that, I guess shakshuka is going to be huge this July. Like, it's just...
What's the name of it? Shakshuka?
Shakshuka? Maybe it's bigger in the UK than it is.
How do you spell it?
I want to say SHAKSHUKA. I think it's a Turkish or Middle Eastern dish, but it's like basically eggs and tomatoes. Delicious breakfast. I think because British food is generally so bad, we basically take pride in stealing, we steal with pride. Like, all of our food that's good is just taken from every other country around Europe. So we saw shakshuka was trending, and that's a big tomato heavy dish. And we thought, maybe there's something around brunch. And then we saw that actually loads of recipes that were trending that had kind of 1 to 2 products or that were really quick to make. And we basically delved down these different roads of, okay, is it that people are wanting to purchase things and cook a bit more like as a family or something like that? And we saw pizza ovens suddenly trending. And we basically, through quant and then later through qual, were able to show that what was happening very simply was that people were just starting to want to cook together more, and were wanting to cook closer to where they were eating. I think it's probably a post-COVID thing, but people didn't want to be in the kitchen cooking for an hour and then see their friends for 10 minutes or see their kids for 10 minutes after that. And we only got to that point really because we saw this really random insight about tomatoes, and then suddenly started going on this kind of inception train with loads of, it's almost like on Wikipedia when you have 100 tabs open, like we suddenly got to this weird answer just from kind of following the nose. So I think that kind of thing we see a lot, I think, in our space.
So something about that, I think a lot of people are looking for the silver bullet, right? The silver bullet principle, but it's really about triangulation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more with that. It's something that we have to battle with quite a lot. It's like when people brief something into data, they're desperate for this kind of, I guess, data point that will win them a can line kind of thing. It's like, is there going to be something which is so incredible and outrageous that a whole campaign can be built off the back of that, and then we can tell this amazing narrative about how we got to that point? My own perspective is, it's not that it's necessarily like a clear process or methodology around what you should do, but it's more to that Agatha Christie point of, like, can you start to piece these puzzles of jigsaw together to give you a perspective that might be new or different, rather than can we find one piece of evidence that we think is so startling it will put the case in our favor kind of thing. One of the reasons why I like the Agatha Christie analogy is because it's not that Poirot has access to like all this different evidence that no one else has access to. He's just able to process it and think about it in a different way and ask the right questions that ultimately get you to the right solution.
Mm-hmm. And with the tomato example, or tomatoes, as it were, what did you end up doing with that? So you found that this was happening in the culture. The grocery store didn't really have anything to do with it. What did the store end up doing with this new knowledge?
So the purpose of what we're trying to do was basically shape the way that we spoke about products in general, and to try and shape timing of campaign and timing of comms. So it helped us get to a place where we're able to change the platform from being predominantly about the food in the kitchen. We actually have this other tool that allows you to look at, it basically allows you to look at every ad in the category and then tries to categorize what the different frames are of all those ads. So you then start to get a picture of typically what kind of products are being shown and what aren't being shown, or what kind of frames are being shown. And we basically found that for this company, most ads were showing the food at the end of the meal basically looking really nice. And that was pretty much it. There's two big components that were missing. There was the actual cooking of it, which we found to be really impactful. Like, people buy food because they enjoy cooking, not necessarily just because they enjoy eating. And then the other thing that was really interesting was there was always this kind of trite image of people basically just eating around a table, two kids and two parents, like perfectly situated, sharing a really nice anecdote over dinner. And like, that's just not how real people eat. Like, most of the time it's messy. There's people like picking food at the table. It's finger food lots of the time. If you're hosting, there'll be people in the garden, there'll be people inside, you're trying to get everyone together. And it's just a much more messy but fun feel. So it changed basically that, food on a table to, right, how do we talk about the story of food more generally? And again, it's just a very random endpoint from a very random start point, which is quite nice and part of the magic of working with really creative people.
Well, one of the things you mentioned a second ago with the story of people gathering around the dinner table, and that's just not the way we live anymore, it seems, or maybe large pockets of society are not like that. There's this idea I've been thinking about, which is, are you marketing to the stereotype or are you marketing to people's actual daily reality? And I think so many people, because it's so easy, they just market to the stereotype.
It's easier than ever has been before to find a data point that will confirm an existing point of view, or that will give you a shallow view of customers. So it becomes even more tempting to use that really easy to find insight than to dig even deeper, because the difference between the superficial data and kind of real rich data is even more varied. Like, it's even harder relatively to get difficult data than it is to get easy data, if I can put it that way. So it's even easier to default to a stereotype than it has been before. And it's a bit like we're trying to find the needle in a haystack. The world of synthetic data is basically throwing more hay onto the pile without actually throwing any more needles in. So we're getting more and more of the same type of data. We're not getting increased richness. We've just suddenly exposed to this massive sea of hay, and we're desperately trying to find these needles. There's actually a really good company out in the UK who we work with quite a lot called Meet the 85, run by a guy called Mark Hadfield, and he will spend a lot of time going into people's houses, videoing what they're doing, and then uses a tool on the back of that to then try and help you understand what the key themes were, or help you delve into that in more detail, which I think is a really interesting way of finding that rich insight and still making it accessible.
What's an example of superficial or shallow data that a brand might have access to that's not particularly useful?
I'm going to be careful with what I say here, but I guess a good example that I'll give is in the electronics space. We work with a big electronics company who part of what they do is make mobile phones. I read this 80-page report. One of the key questions across any category that you'll try and answer first and foremost might be, what are the key category drivers and how does my brand perform relative to each of those drivers, so I can start to understand if we were to move the needle across this driver, what impact would that have on sales for my business? So a very standard kind of insight question. And this report came back, and the top three category drivers, number one was trust in brand. Number two was, from memory, the size of data that existed, so the data capability of the phone. Number three was a camera, and number four was longevity of battery life or something like that. I think that's a good example where it seemed like ostensibly that tells you quite a lot, right? Okay, I've now got this ranked order of this kind of emotional lever, which is brand. But when you start to think about it for more than 5 seconds, you're like, okay, what does that actually mean? Like, all of those are related really heavily to each other. And there's 60 pages basically telling me stuff that I probably knew intuitively. It's really incumbent upon the brand to accept that actually you might need to spend a bit more money to explore a few of those different drivers in a bit more detail to understand why do people want a good camera now? Okay, people are on mobile phone. Okay, is there a cohort? Is there a specific group of people who want a camera for a very specific reason? Are they doing more video calls for work? Are they traveling to specific locations and wanting to take photos for Instagram? Where are they traveling to? What is the reason why they need really good quality pictures for their Instagram? Like, what is it about themselves and what makes them have an element of kind of fulfillment about going on those holidays and posting it? And it's only when you start to answer those questions and get into those details that you can start to communicate to those individuals in a way which isn't just this kind of really boring top line category driver, but which is actually something that might engage with them. I think 80-90% of reports that you get back give you maybe the first of 15 jigsaw pieces. And that's fine. There's still a role to be played, but there's still a lot of jigsaw puzzles to find.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I tend to think of the cultural and category data as useful, but often pretty superficial. The cultural data can lead you to some very interesting tensions, but the category data, it's like it's table stakes. Everybody in the category hopefully knows this data. And so I often find that it's a little too high level. And for me, it's usually the customer level data where things start to get really interesting. But can you think of an example where the category or the competitor data was saying one thing, but when you dug into the customer data, you learn something else?
It's a really, really interesting question. I do think, just to go, I guess, expand on your point with the category data piece, I think one of the big challenges that we have is slight navel gazing when it comes to broad understanding of a category. So I guess, just to take an example, like we work with a big telecoms provider, and if we were to answer the question, like, what are the biggest needs that people have for connectivity, that's going to be very different to answering the question of what might those needs be if only we were to advertise that those needs may exist. Often people haven't thought about those needs yet. And the way to explore that is to understand what pain points might be that might be completely adjacent to that category. Like, what are the things that people are genuinely struggling with in their lives? And then the secondary question is there a role that our brand could play in helping people improve and helping people get over that pain point? The first question that a brand often asks themselves might be, like, what are the pain points within my category? And I just wish a lot of the time we'd instead ask the question, like, what are people's pain points? And then, can I find a role for my brand within those? Is there a genuine product market fit or not? That's definitely an area where we see, I guess, the biggest say-do gap. It's an Ogilvy quote, which I love. So people don't think what they feel, say what they think, or do what they say. And I think that's almost becoming increasingly true. A good example of that is I used to work for a large chocolate brand. So they believed that something like 40% of people made their decision about what chocolate company to buy based on essentially the mission and purpose of that chocolate brand, you know, whether they had renewable chocolate or whether they avoided slave labor, etc., and spoke about those things. So we did 2 surveys. We asked people in general what the reasons were. And then what we did is commissioned a survey where we specifically asked people immediately after buying a chocolate bar. So we had people stationed outside shops and we asked them, why did you buy that chocolate bar? And the number dropped from something like 41% to like 4% when we asked in those different contexts. Just for clarity, I'd seen a study that had done a really similar thing. So I was copying someone else's amazing idea. I didn't come up with that myself, but I love the idea, and I still kind of toy with that idea quite a lot of, like, how do we start to ask questions in a more meaningful context, in a more meaningful way? I think it's a really important thing to do. If you genuinely care about finding out the truth, it's not good enough just to rely on kind of the top line panel data and say, right, my job's done.
Yeah, I mean, I often recommend that people look at the periphery when it comes to data. You know, we talk about these WTF data points, but looking at outlier data that a lot of people ignore because they just think it's an anomaly. Are there any other examples where a peripheral data point ended up being incredibly valuable to you on a project?
I think one example that comes to mind, so I've worked for a lot of supermarkets, haven't I? This is a different supermarket. So one of the things that we're doing was trying to reboot the way that they segmented their audiences. And they had this segment, there's something like 20 million customers, and maybe 10% of those were using their loyalty card. And they had 6 segments or something. And there was one segment which was just called like unsegmentable. So there's like 2 or 3 million people who they just couldn't understand at all, and they just basically decided to ignore. They're like, oh, these baskets are just completely random, like no idea what's going on, let's just ignore it. And I was like, let's have a look at those guys a little bit more. So they had the highest average order value, they were the most loyal. It's like, maybe we should consider these guys a bit more. As we got into the data a bit more, it turned out there were basically people who were shopping for 3 generations at a time. So there were people who were shopping for their kids themselves and their own parents, which is why the baskets were so messy and why so random and sporadic, because they had so many different needs. And actually, there were a group of people who are largely ignored in marketing in general. Like, there's this big group of people who are, you know, parents of kids who might be in their late teens, whose parents also really need support and who are really struggling in so many different aspects of what they do. What it helped us do as a part of the segmentation piece was say, right, let's not ignore this group. Let's work out how we can talk to them about needs that they might have. Let's make their shopping experience easier. Let's give them offers that are definitely going to be relevant for all 3 generations. I think there's probably 2 very different ways of approaching data in our world. I think there's, I guess, media agencies / consultancies to some extent, where what they're ultimately trying to do is find the best way of making a decision against a number of specific options. So there might be five very specific categorized options, and they're saying, right, which of these 5 options is best? Data team, can you basically do a cost-benefit analysis of these 5 things? But if you're in a world of creating something new, so that's like a net new product, or so new product development, or like creative stuff, like you're not choosing from a finite number of options. You need to use data as a source of like illumination. So you need to try and use it to inspire a different direction that you might not otherwise have chosen, in which case the role of data basically fundamentally flips. It goes from being, how do I understand what's happening on aggregate, so I can behave in a way that optimizes like overall profit for my business based on existing constraints, to how do I find something interesting and new that is different to what other people are doing that might allow me to play in a new space. And I think it's one of the risks of our industry is treating the wrong type of question with the wrong type of approach. And they do fundamentally need different approaches, in my view.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. With that supermarket example, how did you figure out that it was a multi-generational shopper?
The first thing that we did is just have a number of different hypotheses. So we kind of sat in a room, looked through a 20 slide deck and said, right, let's understand this group in more detail. How old are they? The age was like varying quite significantly, but actually we saw kind of weirdly mainly two bumps. So like a bump in 40s and 50s and another bump in the 70s and 80s using the same loyalty card. So that was kind of the first little clue. We commissioned a very specific piece of quant around it. So we started to ask people why they're shopping, what products were being purchased for what need. And we eventually understood that the vast majority of these people were that cohort. Ultimately, the only way you can know, in my opinion, for sure, is by asking them, like having real conversations in a room where you're having open-ended qual conversations. And I think, again, there's a bit of a danger of people who specialize in a specific type of data, whether that's qual or quant, or whether that's social listening or what have you, to massively overemphasize the importance of what they do against what other sources may arise. And I think one thing I've started to realize, like, as I've got and seen more experts do what they do, is just how valuable like all of these different jigsaw pieces are. Like, it's not like data is more important than a meaningful conversation. Just because that one conversation is anecdotal and might not be statistically significant doesn't mean it's not giving you a richness that you simply can't get from doing a large scale quant survey. And I think it's imperative on all of us to just understand what the role is of each of those different sources of inspiration.
There's always this tension between gotta move, gotta earn sales, and gotta learn something, right? And I love the Marty Neumeier quote that says something along the lines of, good research is the least amount of information that gets you out of first gear and onto the highway.
I really like that.
When you are proposing a research project, do you have like a quick and dirty version that we're going to get some for you here in the next 3 to 5 days? Or is it usually like a longer study?
Oh, I mean, massive variation. But I would say, and maybe this is a slight indictment of the way that the industry is going, but there's an increasing need for urgency, and obviously an increasing lens on cost. The way that I often frame it in my mind is there's a tension between exploration and learning new things and exploitation. So exploiting what you already know. Most businesses, if you think you already know something, you're unlikely to explore it further. You're unlikely to commission a piece of insight to try and find something new if you have this data point that already exists in your head and you think, okay, yeah, of course I'm not going to commission a 50 grand project if I feel like I already know the answer. And that's quite dangerous because we just enter this world of kind of confirmation bias.
And hubris. I already know this. I don't need to ask any other questions around this. It's settled.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I often joke that one of the biggest challenges we have is if we tell somebody something they already know, then it's boring and we haven't added any new value. If we tell them something that's new and interesting, then they don't believe you because they thought something different. We're constantly trying to find that battle of being believable, telling the narrative whilst also being interesting, which is hard.
It is very hard. Now, when we were talking the other day, you mentioned how sometimes there will be these data points that are almost lodged in company mythology. Nobody knows where they came from, but they get repeated over and over again. They're in all of the presentations. And you called these company myths. What's an example of a company myth that you had to challenge with fresh data?
Where to start? I think I actually think this is one of the biggest challenges we have is it's so hard to challenge somebody who already thinks they know something, especially if that involves a cost. But I think there's a good example. So it's probably about 4 or 5 years ago. So I was working on a telco where there was this widespread belief that the consideration window for purchase was 3 months. So they believe that basically 3 months before the end of the contract, that's when you start that journey to try to understand and explore different options. And their whole kind of customer journey planning, their whole marketing plan from a retention and loyalty perspective was all centered around this key moment 3 months before you finish. And we managed to do the research because purely through anecdotal information, we used to ask people around the office, like, how long do you normally spend? And we basically found it was something like 2 or 3 weeks. And we're like, okay, we probably should just test that this 3 month thing's actually right. So we commissioned some research and it actually turned out to be more like 3 weeks. And it's like, okay, well, the entire kind of customer journey, all of these, hundreds of thousands of pounds spent on this kind of hyper personalization CRM platform was basically unwarranted. So that's one example. There's another interesting example which I've actually seen multiple times now. So there's a fashion company I used to work on. I don't think there was even any research that backed this up. It was just an idea that they all had, which was the more affluent you are, the more price inelastic you are. So basically, there's no point in giving offers to people who are very rich because people who live in rich areas who are very wealthy, they're just happy to pay on full price. And it's just fundamentally not true. And it's proven to be untrue a lot of the time. Actually, the more wealthy you are, sometimes the more likely you are to look around and potentially be discerning. Again, these just kind of big decisions about it, like something like pricing, to our point about kind of incrementality earlier, just continual suboptimal decisions based on almost a random data point that was never even explored.
Well, you mentioned, starting with a telecom company, just doing some anecdotal research. And that idea of anecdotal evidence isn't enough. I often find that it's very directional and that it absolutely should be explored or confirmed through quantitative means so that you can say, look, it's not just 4 people in the office. We have a little bit of a sampling bias here, but this is kind of where the direction is going. But oftentimes people just poo-poo the anecdotal evidence. They say that's not good enough. We need statistically significant data. What do you say to people in those situations?
I often talk a lot about qual sandwiches. So the idea that you do qual to understand what the key questions are that you want to understand and to formulate some hypotheses that you think are interesting around whatever the question is that you're trying to identify. You do some quant to try and validate those. And then you back it with qual again. So you understand, now that I understand the quant and I understand that these things are actually true, I want to understand more about why they're true so that we can kind of frame our response as well as possible. It's a process, so it's not an overnight thing, but I think it's a useful approach. Not everything can be validated with data, and data is only one lens, but I do think it's an important lens. It might be a Bezos quote, but it's something like, if one person says something anecdotally and the data says something different, then always believe the person who says the anecdote, not the data. I don't necessarily buy that. I do think we are all so intrinsically biased, and we are, especially in the marketing space. Most people live in London, went to university, are relatively well-to-do. We're just not that in touch. And in the UK, we see things like Brexit happening, and everyone's like, why has Brexit happened? It's like, well, maybe because we don't actually understand the average person, because we live in such an insane bubble. Maybe if we got out of our house a bit more and actually spoke to people a bit more, we might not be so surprised. I think the same was true in the US, especially the first Trump election. People were very surprised by that. It's quite naive of people, I think, in our industry to think that we can understand 58 million people in the UK, 360 million people in the US, just through a few anecdotal conversations. But that's not to say that they don't give you great direction. I just think that you can't then claim to have a really deep understanding of how people think, feel, behave. I don't think there is necessarily a right answer, but I'm definitely pro-data.
Are there specific data tools that you use that help you interrogate the data more effectively?
I'm sure most people listening to this will be very familiar with using Google Trends data, etc. But I think the key is using tools like that in a smart way. So, for example, we've built a product. It's basically using Google search data to look at what people search for, and then it takes the top 8 things that people are most likely to search for, having searched for that, and it takes the top 8 things that people are most likely to search for, having searched for each of those things, and it gives you this massive map, which is really interesting to start to understand the typical journeys and paths and adjacent searches that people do relative to different search terms. So it's using kind of a very simple tool in Google Trends and then trying to understand, right, how do we start to map out the journeys that people might go on using that tool? And there's a really good book called Everybody Lies. I would implore everyone to look it up. I think it's about 5-6 years old, but it's a guy who decided to try to verify large stereotypes through looking at people's search behavior. So he found, for example, that like Democrats and Republicans often show very little differences in the kind of things that they search for, despite what you might think. So there's loads of really interesting stuff that you found within that, but it goes back to, if you can't understand and get the truth from what people are saying, what do you revert to? Well, you can revert to what people are searching for. You can revert to what people are watching. You can try and understand how people are behaving. And that's really, your best source of truth.
That book, by the way, was also recommended by Greg Hahn in season 2. So you're in good company.
Yeah, maybe that's why it's on my mind. The other thing I'd say about search data on that is it's very good at helping you understand timeframes. So, for example, working with a large retailer, and we're trying to understand, how does Christmas shopping change and what are the main themes around it? And we found that, like, really simple things, but we could see, for example, like the exact day when people's behavior went from like buying a nice thoughtful gift for my wife to like gift card. And it's like emergency holiday the day before that I can book and not have to deliver in time for Christmas Day. Like stuff like that, I think, is a really interesting use of those kind of tools. So we could see that people search for presents for their dad like 4 weeks later on average than they search for presents for their mum. I think a lot of it is in the creative way of using these tools rather than necessarily the tools themselves. And obviously, we're really lucky as part of Publicis Group. We have, but I think a lot of the time you can get 80-90% of the way there with what's available freely.
You mentioned that it really comes down to the mindset or the questions that you ask the tools, not necessarily the tools themselves. What are 2 or 3 questions you like to ask in the beginning of a project to really crack things open?
I think there's probably 2 things that I try and understand early doors. So one of them is, first and foremost, the role that specific individual or client wants data to play. There's an old saying, which is like, don't use statistics like a drunk person uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. I kind of disagree with that. Like, there's a time and a place where actually statistics and data is there to support an existing idea. And I think knowing what the role is that you're playing for that specific question that client is asking, or really for that decision that client's trying to make, like knowing what the role of data is for them, I think is really important. So I might ask something early on, like, how did you come to the decision to like focus your brand on this audience, or like talk me through your last campaign and decisions that you made to get there. And it just helps me understand the process that they make to decision making in general, and therefore what role I need to play to help them get to a place where they're getting to both a better answer, but also having assurance that they've found the right answer. And I think the second thing that I try to understand is really understanding why people are behaving in a certain way within a category. So like, why are people buying that product? What are the main category drivers? Why someone's choosing a specific brand once they are choosing to buy into that category? That's basically the first exam question. And then suddenly the roots kind of go from there. And that might take you into a space where actually it's mainly driven by a very specific need, or it's mainly driven by customer or competitor behavior, or it's mainly driven by something cultural. And you're able to then go down your detective route and start asking those secondary and tertiary questions that get you to formalization that allows you to internalize what's actually going on.
So you can never end with just the first question. That's what I'm hearing, is you always have to have secondary, tertiary questions, follow-up questions to really follow your nose, right?
What I'd encourage most people to do is to basically get learning as early as possible in your career how to use tools that are readily available if you are a strategist or if you are in a decision-making capacity. And then you can kind of follow your nose yourself. I think it's really important that you don't engage in too much fence throwing between, a data team and a strategy team, and actually you try and bond those teams together as far as possible, because exactly to your point, you ask one question and extremely quickly a good analyst will then be asking a second question. And if the person who's briefed them in has gone away, left the desk, or they're throwing a brief over the corner, then you kind of left making these decisions by yourself, and it's not a good position to be in.
You've mentioned customer segmentation a couple of times, and a lot of businesses focus on customer segmentation, but you have a different approach. You have a tool that helps you segment key moments. Can you tell me more about that?
I guess my starting point is that I think we do segmentation quite badly as an industry. And I think that's because there are so many different use cases for segmenting your audience. And I think the reason why a media team want to segmentate their audience is to be able to improve efficiency and effectiveness through their media channels. The reason why a creative team might want to segment is to have much more clarity over who the ultimate design target is and what the different communication pillars need to be beneath that in order to make sure that they communicate effectively to everybody, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that one of the biggest mistakes that everybody makes is most customers aren't defined by who they are, but by the context within which they're found. There's a story that I really like, which I remember reading about when I did behavioral economics at uni, and they did an A/B test on monks. So there were monks who were taking their monk exams or whatever exams monks need to take, and they placed a beggar in between the entrance hall room and the exam room. And they told half the monks that they were in a massive rush and they were going to be late for the exam. And they told the other half that they had loads of time, don't worry about it. And funnily enough, the half that were in a rush all ignored the beggar, and the half that weren't in a rush went and gave money or whatever and chatted to the beggar. And anyone watching that would have been like, God, these monks are assholes. They're just walking straight past this beggar, which obviously isn't true. It's just the context within which they're found. I guess context is at least as important, if not at times much more important, than people's characteristics. Therefore, to round back onto what we've done, one of the things that we try to understand is what are the different patterns of behavior that we see, and then how do we create a segmentation of those patterns of behavior? So we have a diary study that we work with, part of the IPA, have a diary study where they capture 30-minute by 30-minute windows, and we take that at a respondent level, and we start to understand, using unsupervised learning algorithm, we basically say, what are the specific patterns that the AI can detect? One of the key things that we're trying to answer is, what are the specific moments or patterns of behavior when people are consuming fast food? And you could understand that through two different lenses. So you could start to say, I simply want to understand what are the 15 different times and patterns of behavior when people are having fast food. That could be a really simple, quite generic question. And you might get to a point where you say, okay, there's treating the kids on a Thursday night. There's being bored on a Tuesday lunch. There's having a cheeky meal before you return to your meal at home pre-commute. But one of the things that we wanted to understand was to find net new consumption opportunities. So instead, we asked the question, what are the moments where there's the biggest difference between people feeling hungry and people actually eating QSR? So can we find moments where people are out of the home, they're walking in the street, they're starving, but for whatever reason, they're simply not engaging in eating fast food? What we wanted to understand was, where is there the biggest difference between people feeling hungry and people actually consuming QSR, so people actually having fast food? Like, are there specific moments where currently people just don't feel it's permissible to have fast food, even though they're starving and out of the house? And we found 3 very specific moments that we thought were really interesting. We thought, right, if our client could play in this specific moment, then they'd basically be playing in a category of 1, because currently no one's having fast food, even though they're starving and out the home. The question then becomes, how do we make it permissible for that brand to occupy that space, rather than like, let's just take some share of some existing moment that people are actually eating in? So it goes back to, how do you ask the tool a more interesting question to get a more interesting response?
Well, there's a brand here in the States called Chewy. Have you ever heard of that brand?
I haven't, no.
Okay, so it's an online pet store, basically. It's the Amazon of pet stores, if you will. And they've mapped out the customer journey around this idea of moments that matter. And they really seem to understand these key inflection points, like when you first get a pet, when a pet dies. And they've built a system of really personalized, human-centered communications that have actually helped them become an $11 billion brand. When a pet dies, for example, I don't know if they do this for every pet, but they will send a pet portrait to the customer to kind of memorialize the pet a little bit.
That's amazing value add. I love those kind of stories. Like, how do you start to use this data in a way which is genuinely meaningful? Like, I guess Spotify Wrapped would be your classic of that. Interestingly, I actually used to work with for a company called Medivet, so a big pet company in the UK. And similarly, we were kind of on this road of like, how do we start to really be as helpful as possible by understanding possible moments of intervention? Can we understand if people are cancelling appointments often, why is it, and how do we help be more flexible around them, for example? Again, there is a really important role for data to play in helping understand how brands basically can be as useful as possible. I think that Chewy example is a great one.
Yeah, you just mentioned data that can help with a value add. Can you think of any other examples where you had a data point and it wasn't like, oh, this data point's going to lead to a huge advertising campaign, but it led to an operational improvement or something that really kept the customer much closer to the brand, which is worth, I think, far more than running another advertising campaign? Can you think of any examples along those lines?
Well, I used to work a lot in a recommendations engine space. So a lot of the time, what we tried to do is to find like stretch options. A colleague of mine was working on a recommendations engine for a large broadcaster in the UK, and they were basically trying to understand how can they not just recommend the next best thing that someone might want to watch and create kind of an echo chamber around content, but how do they stretch them into a new category, which is both more useful for them because it helps them discover something new, whilst also being something that's actually useful and engaging for that individual. And again, I just love the idea of how do you start to change the question from like, how do I just simply sell more product X tomorrow to how do I ensure I'm personalized in a way that actually adds value.
Yeah, in the book, I had this idea of try it free Tuesdays because I recognize that everybody, when they go to a restaurant, they almost always buy the same thing, one or two things. If you go to a Thai restaurant or whatever is your favorite place, it's always the same thing. And so that restaurant, probably has many other things on the menu, and there's only so many times you can eat pad Thai.
Yeah.
So what if they came up with basically, on Tuesdays, they would make kind of a batch of something that would be adjacent, right, to everybody's favorite meal. And they would just say, look, we're offering this for free. Would you like to try it? No charge. It's a quarter portion or something like that, or a 1/8 portion of what you'd normally get. And that way the person can try it, because that risk, you always feel this risk when you go into a restaurant. Do I want to try something new, or do I want to go with the old reliable?
Yeah, you're almost perfectly explaining the kind of exploitation concept we mentioned earlier. So there's another good book called Algorithms to Live By, where they talk about this almost precisely, which is they try to mathematically work out at what point should you basically stop your hunt for either a new employee or should you stop your hunt for a new house. And it's something like after you go 33% of the way through your search, you should then pick the best option that you then see compared to previous options. It's something, trying to encourage exploration, I think, is a really important thing for us in general as a society, because I think it's so easy for us to be trapped. And I think it's the same with jobs. I think it's the same in almost every walk of life. We're so habitual as creatures that we just don't know what kind of utility we might derive from something new just around the corner, to sound too much like an economist. But
that's a huge thing, because the echo chamber of algorithms, right? They want to basically keep us in these little bubbles. And so there is that danger of just being like, well, I know all these things. I don't need to consult with anybody else or talk to anybody else. I think this point about exploration is huge.
And I think part of the challenge, exactly to that point, is the builders of those algorithms are incentivized to continually optimize to short-term attention. So they're not trying to build a 15-year engagement plan. They're trying to build, how do I basically get them to click on this next thing and just hope that pattern of behavior will continue to exist forever. That is not a way of increasing both long-term productivity and general fulfillment. There's a very good book called Stolen Focus, which I would highly recommend to anybody, which talks about the negative impact of basically short-term algorithms and how we can try and get about avoiding those. But yeah, I think it's a real issue.
There's got to be a book called The Addiction Algorithm, isn't there? There's got to be.
If not, then call it now. Yeah. Buy addictionalgorithm.com. I'm going to do it now. Yeah.
That's right. All right. Before we get to the speed round, I want to talk to you about, because we can't talk about anything these days without talking about AI. Do you think that AI in its current iteration can do the work of a data analyst?
It should be able to. And I think this is part of the challenge that people grapple with, is like logically, there is no amazing reason, if you think about it for just a few minutes, there's no logical reason why AI, the whole role of an analyst, couldn't be expendable. If you start to think about it more like 10 to 15 minutes, or if you've worked in a space, you kind of realize quite quickly why that's not the case. And it goes back to a few things that I've already said. I think the first is the importance of train of thought, in that so often you find something interesting that changes the entire question. And unless you are able to program an agent to understand how your thought process works in totality, then you're not going to be able to train very easily. I also think that there are trade-offs that are just rife that analysts need to account for. So for example, there's a continuous trade-off that we have to grapple with, which is between explainability and accuracy of our models. So a lot of the time we might be able to build a model that's extremely accurate, but actually it's really hard to explain why the algorithm has said the optimal price for beans should be £3.20, not £3, even though it will decrease short-term sales. We think it will improve long-term sales, and the algorithm's told us that. Like, that's a hard thing to sell in. And it's really hard for an AI to know what that balance should be. I think the second reason is there's lots of contextual clues that are given while someone's briefing you in that you often wouldn't, as a briefer, necessarily stipulate. So, for example, like risk profile, people often don't know their own risk profile, but somebody who's worked with someone for a long period of time or worked in a business knows what that business's natural risk profile might be. And again, it's something that a really good analyst will intuitively know, and an AI probably wouldn't. And I think thirdly, like storytelling is so important, and being able to really engage, the ethos and pathos. Like, how do you sell the narrative, not just how do you show the data? And again, at the moment, I haven't come across a good AI that allows you to do that very well. I think if you're a junior data analyst listening to this, I think there are two things that will probably set you apart and really add value. I think the first of those is really knowing what the right questions are to ask and making sure that you continue that curious mindset. Yeah, double down on curiosity, double down on trying to understand what questions different people might be trying to ask. But I think the second, which is often undervalued, is the ability to really tell that narrative through the data. So how do you really win hearts and minds through making sure that what you explain isn't just a series of numbers? It's a really clearly formed narrative that plays to people's emotions using data as the rational input.
Can you think of an example where AI helped you find something that the human eye was unable to?
We have access to lots of behavioral data, which is often like extremely long and often unstructured big data sets. And we're able to like anonymize, pull in. And I literally asked the question of, I've labeled everybody in this data set who I'm interested in with an X in this column. Can you tell me what these people tend to over-index on? Like, what are they doing that's different to everyone else in this data set? And it came back with like 15 things that when I verified were all genuinely accurate. I had to prompt it in such a way which was really clear, and I had to tell it what all the variables were, and I had to structure it in a way that it understood. But increasingly, it's getting better. There is actually a way of structuring data, which is probably a bit technical for this conversation, but it's I've been reading about it recently. So it's called quant, which is basically a way of ensuring that your data set is readable by an AI. But I think things like that will be increasingly common.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Croissant?
Croissant. Yeah, not exactly like the French bread. I've no idea. I don't profess to be an expert, so I don't know why it's called croissant, but it caught my eye.
Because it's rich and buttery, James. Because it's rich and buttery.
That must be. And flaky. No, definitely rich and buttery.
Just like an insight should be. All right. Yeah. So we're at our speed round. What's your favorite number, data man?
Oof. Yeah. What a question. I think people often have favorite colors and favorite names and stuff, but I'm not sure how many favorite numbers. I would have to say, like, if pushed, I would say, this is going to be a very geeky answer, but I love pi as a number. It's like 3.14159, whatever the rest of them are. And I love the golden ratio. So I think it's like 1.62, 1.16. Yeah. But basically, these are numbers which are what we call irrational. So you can't find them by just dividing kind of one integer by another integer, one whole number by another whole number. They're not an obvious number, but they're really, really important. And the reason why I love that is because I think it makes me realize just how arbitrary, like, the way that we've developed numbers and all of our systems and codes actually are. And there's no logical reason really why we count to 10 or why 1 is a number. It's quite an interesting thought, really, that actually some of the most important numbers are these kind of completely irrational numbers.
Well, speaking of numbers, the invention of 0 as a number was something that kind of like blew my mind. You sort of think, well, 0's always been there, but no, it was invented.
All numbers and all language are really just products of the human imagination. Like, I'm a bit obsessed with the history of measurement. Like, measurement basically first started because in Uruk, so it's like a town in Mesopotamia, they were basically trying to find a way of trading. And what they did is they imprinted symbols on clay tablets to say, okay, this is what I'll trade you. And then they gave people these stones that were filled with what they promised to trade. So they could see on the imprint that here's what I'm going to trade and here's a stone I'll give to you, that basically is me formulating that contract. And what they found was it was easier just to write on the tablet what they were willing to trade, and then they could all refer back to it later. And that's basically how language started. And I just love the idea that before that point, there was no obvious method of communicating these things other than through seeing my 3 sheep and giving you 2. So yeah, measurement's quite important.
That's fascinating. Well, what's a subject you recently got super interested in and just went down a rabbit hole because of insatiable curiosity?
Another thing I've been a bit obsessed with recently is visual perception. There's this problem in the field of visual perception, which is called the inversion problem. So basically the idea is if I'm looking at something, it is physically impossible for my brain to accurately and perfectly reconstruct what I'm looking at because there are so many factors that affect the way that I've perceived that object. So everything from the light that's shining on it, to the material that it's made out of, to the particles it's having to transmit to get to me, to how far away it is. And I don't actually know if this glass is this close to me or not. My brain is just making a best guess based on the information I have. And it's impossible for me to actually work it out. And I've become a bit obsessed with this idea because I think it's just so true to basically everything that we do, which is we don't really know the truth of anything around us. All we're doing is trying to get as close as the truth as we possibly can, and trying to reconstruct that truth that may have happened in the past or happens now.
We're getting deep. We just went.
Yeah, sorry.
we need some scuba gear because we just went deep.
That reminds me, I have the piss taken out of me repeatedly because I was pitching once and somebody said, God, you must have been absolutely drowning in data. And me being like the 26-year-old geek I was, like, oh no, for me, it's more like scuba diving. I love it so much. And they basically rinsed me for that for the next year. But yeah.
That's funny. What's your favorite word in English or any other language?
This is terrible. I can't actually remember what language it is, but it's something like kosselig. And what it is, it means the like insatiable desire to hug somebody or to show affection towards somebody. So the idea that, that feeling you have when my daughter walks in and I just want to give her a massive hug. And we don't really have a word to describe that very effectively. I love the idea that we're such a product of the language and vocabulary that we have access to. Like we can only really think in those terms. I love the idea that actually there's a whole other languages and ways of describing things. That might be through numbers. It might be through learning new languages that give you a whole new perception of how the world works and human emotion.
And what was your favorite subject in school?
Not maths. Probably history. I'm very interested in understanding human behavior. And like for me, data really is just a conduit to that. And I think one of the things that I'm quite obsessed with is trying to understand what are the kind of genuine universal human truths. And I think history is quite an interesting lens to look at that. Like the way that people behaved in the 14th century under completely different conditions is obviously very different to the way that we behave now, and giving us all an understanding of what human nature really is, I think is important. And I think history is the only way to really understand that, because it just gives you access to so many different contexts that help you understand humans better.
Now, you've mentioned already a lot of good books that you'd recommend. What's the most recent good book you've read that may not be work related, but just made you think, wow, that was amazing?
I love Marcus de Sautoy, and I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong. I've actually never heard it said out loud. He wrote a really good book. I think it's The Mathematics of Creativity. Or is that How Mathematics Shapes Creativity? His thesis is that we kind of taught from a very young age that art and science are kind of diametrically opposed. And he basically has written an entire book that explains how intertwined those two subjects are. And it obviously speaks to me because I passionately believe that to be true. We're an industry obsessed with false dichotomies. And one of the worst of those is you like history, you like art, join this camp. You like maths and science, you're in this camp, and that's the rest of your lives.
Is there a brand whose work you really admire, or you think to yourself, that's so good, I wish I'd come up with that?
I'm going to go slightly left field. And this isn't necessarily a view of the business, but of their brand and ability to market. And I'd say like System One, as the B2B like creative testing platform. Have you come across them?
But I know about Daniel Kahneman's work with System 1, System 2.
Yeah. So this is a business, maybe they're mainly based in the UK, but they're everywhere. So they're all over Cannes. They've got really good partnerships with the likes of Mark Ritson, and I'm just continually impressed by their ability to get their voice out. Worth looking at. They try and add value, so they genuinely write things that are useful and interesting to lots of marketers. I definitely think they've been exceptional with how they've grown that as a brand in the B2B space.
Here, I thought you were going to maybe mention a chocolate bar or a beer or something, but it's a data processing group.
yeah. Yeah. No comment.
What's one of the most interesting jobs you had before you got into the work you do now that has helped you do your job better?
I had a few jobs as a teenager. So I worked as a professional glass collector, as I like to describe it. So I was 16, so I wasn't old enough to serve alcohol, but I was able to go and collect glasses. So that was good fun. I worked as a tennis coach for a little while, which I absolutely loved. But I think the one that's probably genuinely taught me a bit more was I used to work in a pharmacy. So I was actually, for some reason, I don't know why the hell they let me do this, but they let me count and dispense drugs. It was checked by a pharmacist. I think doing any job at that age, I think especially a job which is quite tedious and requires lots of concentration for long periods of time, I think it's a really good skill for kind of any kid to do. But it was my first insight into kind of genuine professional life and definitely taught me a lot about just general work ethic and behavior, etc.
When you said professional glass collector, I thought maybe you'd be walking along the beach just finding shards of glass, but it was picking up glasses in like a restaurant.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Gotcha. What's a piece of advice that you got early on in life or in your career that you still remember to this day or that you think of often?
My grandparents were very wise. And I remember something that my grandma said quite early on, which is basically like the answer to everything is almost always balance. It's almost always, a bit of this and a bit of that. And I think that's something that I think about quite a lot, whether that's trying to find a balance between seeing my daughter and wife and doing as well as I can at work, or use of data versus anecdote. We're a culture at the moment that is increasingly obsessed with specialism and maybe running hard and fast and maxing something. And I kind of feel like in general, we need to go back to a bit more balance.
I love that advice. I wrote down something once in my notes, everything in moderation. And then I wrote to the extreme. because the paradox of it just seemed too good not to.
Yeah. Maybe not everything in moderation. There are some things that should just be avoided, but yeah, lots of things in moderation.
Well, James, thank you so much for sharing your process, your data-driven process for finding aha moments, and for taking the time with me today. I appreciate it.
No, it's been really lovely to chat to you, Chris.
Thanks again to our guest, James Addlestone from Saatchi & Saatchi. If you want to connect with James, you can find him on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast platform and share it with colleagues and clients who could use some inspiration. Just send them a link and say, "You see, this is what I'm talking about. Insights." If you'd like to nominate someone for a future episode of Any Insights Yet, head on over to chriskochek.com and send me a note. While you're there, check out my newest online courses, case studies, and creative exercises. You can even sign up for one of my insight workshops where I show you firsthand how to build effective insights faster. The workshops are great for helping with new business pitches and for getting to those aha moments that can lead to culturally contagious campaigns. Special thanks to Megan Palmer for editing, sound mixing, and production support. Until next time, keep looking for patterns, finding contradictions, and asking, what if, more often.